Questions nobody asks. With a John Michael Swifter. What, was that bad?
So I've really been working with this A432 thing, just tuning all my instruments into it, really looking for something to change about it, and no magic. I gotta say, this ideal of being in tune with nature, I think is a really solid one, but there's really no evidence to me that 432 is in tune with anything other than a prime number system. So at the best, I would describe it as kind of a benignly misguided notion that 432 is special as a pitch standard. But the question nobody seems to ask is this conspiracy distracting us for a much more real one that's actually causing problems? And I would argue that our tuning system is actually out destroying other cultures around the planet, and we're kind of complicit in the whole thing. And the destructive past that is leaving is basically making space for marketing techniques that are actually destroying other levels of other parts of culture. So I would say it's about time to look at Equal Temperament. For those who haven't read it, there's a very interesting book called Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. It's a story about African colonialism when it kind of shows a picture of an African tribe before and after contact with European missionaries, and how the culture kind of gradually unraveled and the whole society just kind of plunged into poverty and violence and all this awful stuff because of a loss of their indigenous culture. And this is a very common pattern, caused by Western hegemony, is that, as Europe has become, more of an imperialist presence throughout the world, the more traditional cultures in those other parts of the world have unraveled, and not always, but frequently it leads to much greater poverty, more culturally than anything, but then as a consequence, economic poverty in these locations. And one of the ways that a lot of folks tend to think of the loss of culture now is the kind of things that ISIS are doing to the historical sites and the artworks in Palmyra, which is truly a loss to especially people who are familiar with the architecture and the artworks in that area. But there's another kind of loss of culture that is a little more fundamental to folks in an everyday way. If you think about a tree that's on a sandy bank, and the way that the roots of the tree keep the bank from eroding. Our culture is very much like that in everyday life. People's patterns, people's work, people's productivity, people's state of mind, a lot of it's related to cultural groundedness. And this is a bit of what's happening with Equal Temperament right now, is the cultural infrastructure that exists in a lot of cultures that were not, necessarily, negatively affected by imperialism at one point. More and more, their indigenous cultural identity is being lost and replaced by Western standards, which may or may not support the original lifestyle or the best possible lifestyle for those people. And part of the problem is that in some ways, Equal Temperament is actually a fairly efficient system. Equal Temperament was invented as a way to work out the differences between a lot of different keys and to make it more possible to modulate in ways that were not possible in a just intonation system. Now, the problem with that is that you basically create this average pitch that's kind of halfway between a bunch of possible just intonation pitches to make it possible to sort of sub one for the other. So Equal Temperament is kind of a catch-all sub for the most common just intonation systems that occur naturally in human cultures. But the problem with that is that when people treat them as equivalent and you lose the tuning subtlety that was in the indigenous culture, well, that's a significant loss of both aesthetic beauty and then also the integrity of the cultural identity of the indigenous group. A lot of Arabic musicians like to talk about this thing called piano hijaz. Now, hijaz is a melodic type from the Middle East. It's a maqam, and it exists throughout most of the Middle Eastern world in one form or another. But it has a very specific tuning, and it's possible because a lot of the instruments either have special frets or because they have no frets at all, so you can play these, quote, microtones. But with a piano, you can't really do that. So the original tuning of hijaz is lost. You can play the melodic patterns, but it doesn't sound quite the same or have quite the same effect. And it really kind of it has this undertone, this kind of suggestion that the original culture doesn't have the same value as the new one where the guitars and the pianos are the main instruments. If you look at India and if you look at Africa and you look at the Middle East and you look at South America and the way the indigenous cultures are gradually being subsumed into the sort of parent culture, I mean, there are some advantages to having a parent culture in the sense that there's a basis for communication. But when there's no basis for people to maintain their own cultural identity and they become economic victims of the parent culture. And the problem is that Westerners have no problem with this, because the fact that everyone uses our tuning system and speaks our language is convenient for us, because then we can go anywhere and everything is in our language and everyone speaks our language and all products can be found in our language. But it's much more work for people who don't come from a culture like that, and it is a very destructive precedent to set to expect everyone to adapt to our way of living. But the fact is that most of us are comfortable doing so because, well, we don't have to do anything for it to be that way. Just by the nature of Western hegemony, other cultures just get toppled down by just us consuming everyday products. Now, the issue that I have with this is that I would argue a lot of the terrorism that we're facing in the world today is because of the erosion of Middle Eastern culture and the complete carelessness of the West in endorsing it, whether purposefully or through willful negligence. Now, a lot of folks will argue rightly that a lot of indigenous cultures have objectively objectionable characteristics. There's a lot of cultural subjectivity involved in these questions, but when you talk about things like, beating children or certain types of corporal punishment, it's not very difficult to argue that those are objectively problematic in the human experience and that replacing those is, advantageous. But the fact is, most of the culture that is replacing indigenous cultures is not a very well thought out culture. It's commercial culture. It's essentially hedonistic stuff that's targeted at 13 to 17-year-olds because that's the quote susceptible age range. And basically their values are being replaced with American ideals of conspicuous consumption. And anyone who's had any kind of communication with anyone in a third world country or a developing country knows this. I've sponsored people in South America for many years. Through my YouTube channel, I've talked to people all around the world, and the ideals of everywhere around the world, everyone wanting to live with an American living standard. That's what everyone aspires to, even if the living standard is mostly based on owning a bunch of stuff we don't need. And to me personally, this is troubling because the population crisis that we're headed towards, between global warming and just the massive growth of the human population, which is totally unprecedented and unbridled. When there's nothing to stop any of this stuff, but all the businesses in the world are basically looking to just grow and consume. We have more people consuming more, and it seems like equal temperament might not fit into that picture a lot. But when you realize what an effective mechanism it is for deconstructing these key pieces through which cultural ethos is passed down, you start to realize it's not an insignificant factor at all. And the fact is that, any person in any kind of position of power, whether it's just a middle-class consumer or, the type of plutocracy that's showing up in our government right now.
If your family has not made hundreds of millions of dollars of contributions to the Republican Party, that you would be sitting here today?
It's in their interest that people in other countries are lost to their parent culture, because then a victim of ours much more easily. And, to me, that's troubling. That's not the world I want to live in. I personally believe in trying to put a government together that, does free the resources back to people, but doesn't do so in a way that disadvantages poor people. And the wealth gap in the world we live in is increasing everywhere. And the way that media conglomerates deliver information to us through the kind of very vivid advertising that they use with, lots of sex, lots of profanity, lots of violence, lots of things that, anyone can understand, especially pre-rational humans are really susceptible to. This is basically their way of milking us for as much money as they can get with no concern about the effect it's going to have on the rest of our lives. Putting a really, really high value on the aesthetics of an indigenous culture, on looking at things outside of the system we're comfortable with, looking for those aesthetic features and saying, these are valuable things. Not only are they just interesting just for their own sake, but also they have a character to them that encourages people, to look to their past, to look to something to ground them, so that they're not just dragged away by whatever hedonistic thing is thrown at them. So the real question that nobody asks to me is, what are 432 conspiracists really afraid of? Well, you hear all this stuff about the Illuminati and the Nazis, and, that stuff may or may not be true with regard to A440. It's clear to anyone who wants to open their eyes is that, the whole world does have a problem of the wealth gap increasing and of, culture being watered down and of media conglomerates taking advantage of people and being a mechanism of the watering down of culture in the favor of turning us all basically into just a consumer machine for them to make more money. And this is, incredibly problematic. When you look at something as simple as a tuning system, it actually can be, not just practically, but also symbolically a technique for fighting this erosion. So if I actually come back around to the idea of, well, what if we did adopt 432 as a standard? Well, what effect would that have? Well, I mean, the most noticeable thing is, well, now you're not going to be in tune with any of the stuff out there. All the tuners out there and all the computer programs and all the standard recordings, they're all in A440. But you know what? Getting out of tune with that stuff might be good if for no reason other than it gives you a very clear indication that you have unplugged from the parent culture that which we're in, which in my opinion has become quite insane. A lot of devices aren't real difficult to reset the pitch standard. And even though I don't know if it's necessarily going to change anything, practically with how it resonates with the universe, what it will definitely do is always serve as a reminder of you of what's your purpose here. Is your purpose to be, a human being to, to experience things in life and to grow from that? Or is it just to, conform to the culture and kind of do whatever the television's telling you to do? And to me, that answer is really obvious. I'm actually, for no other reason than that, I would seriously consider moving to 432. And actually, since I do a lot of things with just intonation anyway, when I start writing down frequencies on paper, 432 is way easier to work with. So to me, there's a couple of practical advantages to switching to that as a standard. But for whatever reason you may or may not choose to do this, I think the main thing to keep in mind is that a lot of decisions that you make that don't seem to have a lot of consequence, they do have a ripple effect on the rest of the world. So whether or not you were obsessing over something that really is, a big lot of nothing, or whether you're acting like certain trends in society are totally okay when really you're basically just kicking the can down the road. I don't believe we live in a time when we can afford to be unconscious of this stuff. I think we have to be open about it. We have to talk with people about it. We have to be sensible and kind in our discussions, but we also have to be firm about what we see. The waters are rising all around us. That's my 2 bits on the topic. If you dig this stuff, keep asking questions. Hopefully I'll talk about some less morbid topics in the future. But yeah, if you dig this, subscribe to the channel, share it, favorite, share it, all that jazz. Conform to the YouTube patterns. Yeah, I hope to catch y'all on whatever I'm going to do next week. Deuces.